There are people who have never spent a single weekend alone in their entire adult life, not because they are unusually social, not because they love people more than everyone else does. Ask them to imagine an empty Saturday with no plans, no messages, no television humming in the background, no reason to leave the house, and watch their expression carefully. Something shifts for a moment. Something small, but immediate. Not boredom. Boredom is light. Boredom is manageable. This is something heavier. It is the expression of someone calculating, almost automatically, how quickly they can fill the silence before whatever waits underneath it has time to rise to the surface, because they have become remarkably good at outrunning something. And they have been running for so long that most of them no longer realize they are running at all. They just call it being busy. The observation made centuries too early. Long before psychology existed as a discipline, before laboratories and experiments and clinical language, philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal arrived at an observation that reads today with almost uncomfortable accuracy. He wrote that all of humanity's misfortunes seem to emerge from a single source: the inability to sit quietly alone in a room. Pascal was not talking about personality differences. He was not distinguishing introverts from extroverts. He was describing something much deeper, a universal movement away from stillness itself. He noticed that people pursued endless activity: hunting, gambling, conflict, entertainment, distraction of every imaginable kind, not necessarily because these things were inherently desirable, but because they prevented contact with something else. The moment activity stopped, something began. Thoughts resurfaced, questions returned, feelings previously buried became audible again. What makes Pascal's observation unsettling is that it arrived centuries before modern psychology and still captures the phenomenon with disturbing precision. He was not diagnosing individuals. He was identifying something structural about consciousness itself. An unoccupied mind eventually turns toward unresolved material. And for most people, that turning feels uncomfortable enough that almost anything becomes preferable to remaining still long enough for it to happen. Modern psychology has spent centuries filling in the mechanism. Pascal noticed the pattern without needing a laboratory, when busyness stops being about productivity. Contemporary research has given this phenomenon more precise language. Psychologist Timothy Pychyl, whose work has focused extensively on procrastination and avoidance, describes chronic busyness as something more than scheduling habits or poor boundaries. In many cases, busyness becomes avoidance coping. Activity itself becomes protective. The constant meetings, plans, obligations, errands, texts, and distractions are not simply filling time. They are filling space, psychological space. The busyness is not happening alongside the avoidance. It is the avoidance, which reframes something that often appears harmless from the outside. Someone who fills every evening, every weekend, every quiet moment with another task may not simply be overcommitted. They may be maintaining a structure, doing enormous emotional work beneath the surface, a kind of scaffolding. Because remove that scaffolding suddenly, and whatever it was supporting does not disappear politely. It arrives all at once, which is why an empty weekend can sometimes feel less like freedom and more like collapse, and why telling someone in this pattern to simply slow down often produces something surprisingly close to panic. Because you are not asking them to rest, you are asking them to remove a wall they have been leaning against for years, when aloneness feels like abandonment. There is another version of this pattern that develops through attachment itself. Attachment research, beginning with John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, identified distinct ways people learn to relate to closeness and separation. For individuals with anxious attachment patterns, aloneness often acquires a meaning that has very little to do with being physically alone. Because in environments where connection felt inconsistent or fragile, solitude stops feeling neutral. It becomes associated with danger. Not physical danger, relational danger. The nervous system learns something early. Alone means something has gone missing. Alone means something important may not return. For someone carrying that template, quiet time by themselves does not simply register as peaceful emptiness. It activates an old signal. The sensation is rarely interpreted consciously as fear of abandonment. It simply appears as discomfort, restlessness, an urge to text someone, to make plans, to hear another voice, to avoid sitting still. Because underneath it, the nervous system is responding not to present reality, but to an older emotional equation. Alone equals unsafe. Which means the need for constant company is not always about wanting people. Sometimes it is about avoiding what their absence switches on, the four things waiting underneath. Psychiatrist Irvin Yalom spent decades examining what he believed sat underneath much of ordinary human anxiety. He identified four concerns that repeatedly emerged across therapy, often hidden beneath other symptoms: death, freedom and responsibility, isolation in its deepest sense, and meaninglessness. Yalom argued that people rarely experience these directly. They appear wearing disguises: restlessness, compulsive achievement, relationship problems, anxiety without an obvious source. And importantly, constant activity functions as one of the most effective ways of keeping these concerns out of view, because motion prevents confrontation. A person surrounded by noise and obligation rarely has enough silence available for deeper questions to emerge. Stillness removes the barrier, and once it disappears, the mind starts asking questions it had previously postponed indefinitely, questions with no comfortable answers. Who am I? What matters? Where is this all going? What happens when everything ends? Those questions do not require trauma to feel overwhelming. Sometimes being human is enough. There is another mechanism that becomes particularly important during periods of transition. Psychologist Jennifer Campbell's work on self-concept clarity examined how stable and coherent a person's sense of identity feels. People with strong self-concept clarity tend to maintain relatively stable ideas about who they are regardless of circumstance. People with lower self-concept clarity often rely more heavily on external feedback. Other people become mirrors. Interaction becomes orientation. Identity gets reflected back continuously. Which means being around others does more than provide companionship. It provides information. Who am I? Am I valued? Am I interesting? Am I enough? As long as mirrors exist, these questions remain answered automatically. But solitude removes the mirrors, and once they disappear, something disorienting can happen. The question surfaces again. Who are you when nobody is reflecting anything back at you? For someone without a stable internal answer, that question can feel less philosophical than destabilizing, because the ground beneath them was never fully internal, it was borrowed. None of this means wanting company is unhealthy. Connection itself is not the problem. The distinction is not how much time you spend around people. It is what happens when those people disappear for a while. Someone with a healthy relationship to solitude experiences an empty weekend as different. Quieter, perhaps slightly dull, but manageable. Someone caught in the avoidance pattern experiences the exact same silence as something closer to an emergency, even when nothing is objectively wrong. And what tends to help is not forcing prolonged isolation immediately. Flooding rarely teaches safety. What helps more often is gradual exposure, small moments of quiet, brief periods of unstructured time, learning slowly that stillness itself is not dangerous. Building the identity, tolerance, and emotional stability that constant movement had been quietly replacing. If you have spent years surrounding yourself with noise, plans, people, and movement, it may never have been boredom you were escaping. Boredom is easy. Boredom passes. What you may have been avoiding is something much more personal, an encounter with old fears, with unanswered questions, with uncertainty, with the version of yourself that never had enough uninterrupted silence to discover what it actually thinks, wants, or is independent of everyone else's presence. That encounter rarely feels pleasant at first. Pascal understood that. But it is also rarely the catastrophe the avoidance taught you to expect. It is simply the room you have spent years walking around, waiting for the moment you finally step inside. Until the next one.